Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to 786 Boulevard. This is episode 47, Islam and the video game industry with Rami Ismail.
The country of Arabistan is the country that, Western developers will put their games in because they can get away with shooting lots of Arabs without having to deal with the politics of the Muslim or Arab world. By the time you're done with an action game set in Arabistan, right, with all the jeeps and the sand and the, vague like chanting in the background and the yellow filter over everything, you've probably shot like 1,000 Arabs. They had like 12 voice lines and 3 of them were Allahu Akbar.
Rami Ismail is a video game developer who is vocal about Muslim representation and misrepresentation in the video game industry. Alongside being the co-founder of game studio Vlambeer, he is also the executive director of gamedev.world, which is a global game developer conference that seeks to showcase developers from all around the world. Today, I'll be speaking to Rami about how Muslims have been depicted historically in video games and how they fare behind the scenes. We'll also be speaking about how Muslim representation in video games is changing and what we can look forward to in the future. I hope you enjoy this conversation and welcome back once again to 786 Boulevard. Rami, salam bro, how you doing?
Alhamdulillah, I just got home from a flight, so I'm a little, a little razzled.
Jet lagged.
Yeah, trying to catch up a bit on reality, but yeah, I'm good, alhamdulillah. How are you?
I'm good, you and me both. I appreciate you taking from your time. I was actually quite fascinated I was reading a bit about you before we had you on, as in before now, and I didn't realize that you were actually affected by by Trump's Muslim ban. I found that quite fascinating. Can you give me like an idea of firstly, I guess, your reactions? The whole world went crazy during that time. I still remember it. But just, right. how exactly you were affected and how your job, if anything, was affected as well.
Well, I think in multiple ways. Like obviously there was a lot more. So for as long as I've traveled, I've been traveling the world since 2012, I think. I've always had problems with random selection and TSA and not just in the US, but like in general in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, even as a European citizen, where that,
wow.
Back in those days, it shouldn't have been a thing, pre-Brexit. But you kind of got used to like Switzerland, Geneva, Vienna, wherever I went, like I would get the random check, right? So you kind of get used to it, but definitely at the time of the Muslim ban, a lot of that intensified, and there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of uncertainty about what kind of travel wasn't allowed, and it was one of the things I spend most of my time on is trying to make sure that game developers, people that want to be creative in the games industry, that they have access to the games industry. And with the Muslim ban, primarily what that meant for me is travel just got more complicated again, especially towards Muslims. There was a lot more scrutiny than before, and there was already a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah.
For a lot of people in the games industry, it wasn't an uncertainty; it was a certainty. There was a certainty that they would not be allowed into the US and into travel. And as part of my job is trying to make sure that opportunities are equal, it meant that for several months, one of my main activities in the games industry was making sure that those people had access to resources and to reimbursements for events that they decided to go to but were banned out of, working with institutions in the games industry to ensure that those people got access to knowledge and opportunities that they were now denied. These are things that keep happening to the Muslim world in general, right? Like from sanctions to bans on travel to discrimination to a lack of trust in financial institutions or just institutions in general. Across the Muslim world, you just kind of see the same patterns repeating, and with an industry that's as US focused as the games industry, it's just very, very magnified.
Yeah, I can imagine. What about I'm actually very intrigued to hear about the behind the scenes of the video game industry, because I feel like it's more diverse than I expected it to be. I don't know if you can perhaps as in us, I gave you the caveat before we started. I'm not an avid gamer. I do play games now and then, But you know, all that we see is, you know, the results of all the hard work, and it's only when you kind of get into the credits that you see all these Muslim names, and you know, you realize how diverse the video game industry is. So can you give us a bit of a you know, a rundown of how diverse the industry is, especially in comparison to other industries like film and you know, other entertainment industries?
I think the games industry is a very interesting place. It's an older place than most people think. A lot of people think of the games industry as like a 1990s kind of thing. But, you know, games started back in the 50s, 60s. Originally was really grew as sort of like a nerdy mathematics rich kids thing, where the people that could afford math education and had access to these big computers that were like room-sized could do like weird experiments to see if they can get their math calculator to play tennis. And that's kind of where games started. Then over time, as home computers became more commonplace, people started experimenting more, and especially in the old days of early days of computing, almost every computer came with a programming language. Like every computer that you had was, you know, MS-DOS and had something like QBasic or Fortran, or like some sort of programming language came with computers. Or was available on computers. And back in the days, a lot of people were computer savvy enough to do some basic scripting because it was just needed. There was no Windows, there was no Mac OS. Everything was command lines. And in that time, actually, really game development sort of spread, development in general, the creation of code spread around the world. And almost without exception, wherever code development went, wherever people learned how to program, they learned how to make games. And you could see these early scenes of game development rise in countries like Egypt, in Iran, in Indonesia, but also in South America, in the Nordics, in Africa. Like wherever computers went, programming went. Wherever programming started, game development happened, because people just like making fun things.
Yeah.
So over time, obviously, the games industry grew really rapidly, and especially in the United States and in Japan, it grew explosively to the point where, two people starting a company in a garage to make some games ended up being 20 people, ended up being 100 people, ended up being 5,000 people. And that's what the EAs and the Activision Blizzards and the Rockstars and all those big game company names that people might be familiar with nowadays all kind of started in that same way. Just a bunch of people in a garage in a time where that still was possible.
Yeah.
Growing things and sort of like lifting along on that economic bubble. But that didn't mean that game development stopped everywhere. It just continued. It just didn't continue at the same level of economic stakes, at the same level of professionalism. So to this day, there are game developers everywhere. And one of the things that I find very fascinating about it is that you don't need these big companies to make video games. I ran a game studio for 10 years called Vlambeer in the Netherlands, and it was 2 people.
Wow.
And with just 2 people, we worked with freelancers, but with those 2 people, we managed to make several like very successful games that also were financially successful, critically successful. And that's really sort of like what the spark is in a lot of the world. And if you're talking about the Muslim world, Indonesia right now is having a tremendous rise in development.
Wow.
But you're also seeing it across the Gulf, in Qatar, in Saudi. You're seeing it in Egypt. There's a lot of development. There's pockets of development throughout the entire Muslim regions. So those people, some of them decide to stay in the countries they grow up in, but a lot of them, when they have these specializations and these relatively specialized skills, they get hired by companies abroad. So they end up working on these sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars productions.
Wow.
Just doing incredible work. And there's really especially nowadays, it was not quite that way 10-15 years ago, but especially nowadays, even in positions of leadership, you're seeing a lot of Muslims, you're seeing a lot of Arabs, you're seeing a lot of Middle Eastern people, seeing a lot of people from across the entire sort of like Muslim world. And that's been good. That's been very good, because when I started, that
I
definitely
know.
wasn't the case.
It's so crazy because, again, I don't want to pretend to be so astute when it comes to the video game industry. I do play games. I have, a few games of mine that I love. I'm a big fan of games like, for example, The Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption. So you can kind of tell anything where I can kind of like kill and get away with it, that's what I kind of enjoy. But I appreciate the storytelling and the art form as well. And I think what I've kind of found fascinating is recently I've seen, elements of diversity in games. So I remember, I'm sure the obvious example that we all go to when it comes to bad representation in games or something a bit, scary, is the first Call of Duty Modern Warfare. When you're in this alien, world, Arabic writing on the walls, which has clearly been just taken off Google and it's not attached properly, and you're just killing, people who are wearing, kafayas on their heads, and it's absolutely nothing. And I think, even till today, I remember playing even the most recent Modern Warfare, which has an Arab character. You have that mission where you have the ability to kill a child, a baby, right? Yeah. And of course, the developers are like, oh, but we are making it, like it's a philosophical choice, and we want to reprimand you for doing that. But it's an Arab baby.
It's an Arab baby. Yeah, they wouldn't make that philosophical choice with a non-Muslim
exactly.
baby.
So it is really scary how these games are kind of perpetuating that. Can you speak a bit about that? I think it is better now, but give us a bit of historical. What is the historical baggage of the gaming industry when it comes to bad Muslim representation?
Yeah. I mean, so one of the most critical things to understand about video games is that they're computer games, right? And computers are not as smart as people like to think. Like, a lot of people like to think that computers are these magical devices and that you can just do anything on them as long as you know how to program it. But especially early on in the days of game development, one of the easiest things a computer can do is calculate a line. Just a line from point A to point B. And if you have to think about what kind of game mechanics you could create with just a line, a bullet comes to mind very quickly.
Yeah.
Goes from point A to point B, and all you have to do is check whether on that line there's an enemy. So the first-person shooter was really quickly a very popular genre. And at first, developers kept it somewhat away from reality. Like, there were games where you fought the Nazis. There were games where you fought robots, demons,
Doom, Quake,
Doom, where you went to hell, Quake, where you went to a foreign planet. Wherever you ended up, it was something like completely fantastical and away from life, or it was the Nazis, because as far as shooting things is considered, I think at least at that time, it seemed everybody agreed that was a valid thing to shoot at. But it changed a bit when games got more powerful. As computers got more powerful, we could represent things in more detail. And then one of the things games really got stuck on, and we were stuck in that phase for almost a decade, is we wanted to be like movies. We wanted to be like board games. That was the goal. So that's why all these old RPGs came out. We wanted to be Dungeons and Dragons, big fantasy worlds. Then the shooters happened. Then we wanted to be like movies. And if you look at movies, around the time this was happening, like late 90s, early 2000s, the big movies were like all movies about, the Gulf War, about, they were all war propaganda. They were U.S. war propaganda to get the U.S. audience to support a war that was, not super popular. And so the first games that sort of like tied into that started getting created. So you have Operation Desert Storm as one of the first big ones. And it was just a game about, I think there's an invasion of Kuwait and you like shoot lots of Arabs. And from there, just kind of like this idea of modern warfare, which Call of Duty was literally named after, sort of started happening. And what really quickly got copied from movies was this Arab-esque country that is like vaguely Muslim, very sandy, and
nameless country,
Yeah.
or like a fake name, basically, fake country.
We've called it Arabistan in the games industry, sort of jokingly. Like the country of Arabistan is the country that Western developers will put their games in because they can get away with shooting lots of Arabs without having to deal with the politics of the Muslim or Arab world. So for a very long time, a lot of developers got away with that because nobody cared, because games weren't that important. To the world, they didn't matter. It was a thing that, nerdy kids did, in their basement or in the attic. And that was it, right? Like we didn't really have a cultural impact on the world, and very suddenly that started changing, and now pretty much everybody plays games. Everybody around the world plays games. Kids grow up playing games, and suddenly we have to sort of like reckon with this idea of like, oh God, this influences people. At that same time, and I'm very grateful for that sort of like rise of Muslim and Arab representation in the games industry and among the people making games started coming up. And I remember in like early 2014, 2015, it was sort of like the first wave of Muslims that felt empowered enough to say something about it. Because up until that point, none of us had the stability to say something. I remember my dad, when I was growing up in the Netherlands, my dad always said like, listen, there's going to be a lot of like unfairness. And my dad always liked to speak out, but he always made very sure that I was careful about whether I spoke up or not. Because he knew what he could get away with in his life, in his situation, at his job. And I was a kid. If I saw something unfair, I was just going to yell about it. But you don't get to do that if you're not in a country where people, like have a tolerance for Arab or Muslim ritual, ceremony, belief. So I was always taught to sort of be quiet. And I don't know why, because, over the years I've seen what happens to people who speak up. Their careers get destroyed, their reputation gets smeared, they lose access to opportunities, they become controversial. Support for a lot of Muslim, Middle Eastern, Arab causes can be a really bad thing for your career. And at some point in 2013, 2014, I sort of got the platform and status that I still have today. And at that point, I realized that what my dad was saying is you can't speak up until you can safely do it.
Right.
Because at that point, you just become the next person who tried to speak up and got washed away. Now, you got to get to a point where you can speak up. You can do it so loudly that nobody can get around you, and you can do it so safely that nobody can stop you.
Yeah.
So when I realized that I had reached that point, I started talking about that. And at that same time, there were a bunch of other people that did the same thing. So over time, we started ridiculing a lot of things. We started making jokes about Arabic being misprinted. Battlefield was a really good example where they had the word hotel backwards. And I gave a really big talk at a really famous design conference where I taught the entire audience enough Arabic in 20 minutes.
Wow.
That they could look at the screenshot and be like, that's wrong. And I was like, this is how little respect these game developers have for our culture, that in 20 minutes, I could teach you enough to prevent this from happening. And on this $100 million production, nobody took a moment to see if the big sign that says hotel is actually saying hotel in Arabic. It was supposed to say fundo, and it said Kdunf.
Wow.
And it took me 20 minutes to teach people that. So I think the ridicule really helped in sort of making it a thing. And to this day, a lot of gamers, a lot of people still send me screenshots of Arabic, of is this Arabic? Is this correct?
Wow.
My friend Ramsi Nasser in New York keeps a blog called notarabic.com, which is phenomenal. If you haven't checked it, you should check it out. But it just collects examples of bad Arabic and everything from Captain America Civil War to Uncharted, the video game. It's just everywhere. So
it's hilarious and sad.
And sad, because that's how little care there was to the cultures, to the people, to the faith. And I think in media at large, and I'm sure you've talked about this on the podcast, Islam is usually sort of orientalized to the point where it has nothing to do with Islam. It's just sort of this vague idea of a very dogmatic people that will stink to their faith in all circumstances, unless it is economically beneficial or whatever. There's always the betrayal. There's always the facade of trustworthiness, and then the eventual betrayal. And that's the good representation we get, right? Because at least we seem good at the start, and that all got copied into games pretty much word for word. The downside is just that in a movie, the hero shoots 20 people. Even in John Wick, I think John Wick shoots 70 people
Yeah.
and that's a hardcore action movie, right?
Yeah.
In a video game, that's like level 1.
Yeah.
You shoot 70 people in level 1 because that's a level.
Yeah.
So by the time you're done with an action game set in Arabistan, right, with all the jeeps and the sand and the vague like chanting in the background and the yellow filter over everything, you've probably shot like 1,000 Arabs. They had like 12 voice lines and 3 of them were Allahu Akbar.
What effect, is there any data that you can speak about or from experience that actually has on the public? Like, for example, when it comes to film, we know a few things. Number one, we know, like you said, a lot of it is propaganda to support the US military war machine. We also know that, for example, after movies like American Sniper, there was literally people coming out and saying, I can't wait to kill Arabs. I've heard, correct me if I'm wrong, I've heard that, there is some sort of correlation between those who play video games like Call of Duty and then those who, get into the US Army and work with drones. I don't know if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah,
beside that, like there's games like, for example, Full Spectrum Warrior, which I remember playing as a kid, which were literally began as tools to be used by the US Army to actually train soldiers. So if you can speak to that,
that hasn't changed much. Like we know that these things work, and I don't currently have the data on me, but what we do know is that it is effective, and the reason we know it's effective is because the US Army has invested for a decade in America's Army, a video game series that is literally made by the US Army to up recruitment for the US Army. And this is a video game series. It's a shooter game. It's similar to a Battlefield. In it, you have 2 teams, the US side and then the insurgent side, which is always sort of like coded accordingly. And both teams see themselves as the US Army. So, to make sure that you're never like, nobody's shooting US soldiers, because that will be unacceptable, obviously. Like shooting like Muslim kids, that's, a philosophical question, but harming a U.S. soldier would be absolute blasphemy in that regard. We know it works because the U.S. Army invests in it, and the U.S. Army is not the kind of thing that invests in something that isn't working. Like if it didn't work, they wouldn't do it. And this idea that the games industry occasionally is very tightly woven with the U.S. Army is also not wrong. Most of the engine manufacturers have contracts with the US Army, and the engines are sort of like the programs that game developers use to make video games, things like Unreal, things like Unity. A lot of them collaborate in some way of shape or form with the US Army. Game development companies used to collaborate with the US Army, and back in the days, I think the US Army had quite some control over the depiction of material that the US Army provided for those games. So the people always joke that Apple products can't be used by bad guys, right? Like that's an actual rule if you want to display an Apple product, which significantly lowers the chance of any Arab character ever using an iPhone in a movie, which, surprising. But in games, it was not that dissimilar. If you wanted to put real US military things in your game, and a lot of game studios wanted to, the US Army used to have a bit of influence over how you depicted them and how you depicted their actions. Recently, I think the biggest example is a game called 6 Days in Fallujah, which personally makes me sick to my stomach because, there is Call of Duty Modern Warfare, right? There is Medal of Honor, there is Battlefield, and they take place in Arabistan. And the idea of Arabistan is that it's a place that is vaguely Arabic, and you shoot us. You shoot us. You shoot Muslims. You shoot Arabs. You shoot Middle Eastern people. But at least there's the argument that none of them are real. 6 Days in Fallujah is very similar to Full Spectrum Warrior, is a war simulation, and the point of that simulation is that it allows people to connect with the U.S. soldiers that went and fought the Battle of Fallujah, the Second Battle of Fallujah, during an illegitimate invasion of Iraq, and the amount of dehumanization you need to do to make a game about an illegal invasion, a conflict where, and not even a conflict, honestly, like in many ways, like a killing, a massacre of people who were forced to stay in the city, were not allowed to leave the city as U.S. forces advanced on it, got caught in the crossfire between 2 really violent groups, the U.S. Army and then the Iraqi forces that were fighting there, or not the Iraqi forces,
The Satari forces.
the terrorist forces that were there, and then the people that were just defending their country, that were just defending their city, that were just living there, that couldn't leave because they were of military age. And you turn that into a video game. Now, I deeply respect video games, and I believe you can make video games about very painful topics, very personal topics, like books, like movies, like music. There should be space for expression, but this is not expression, it's exploitation. And the thing that got to me, the thing that really, really got to me, is there's this thing called procedural generation. And what procedural generation is a method to allow a game to generate levels for you. There's entire genres of games that are dependent on this, because it means that what happens in the game is somewhat unpredictable. You know your character, you know the kind of enemies you might face, the kind of tools you might come across, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen, and it keeps it tense. So what 6 Days in Fallujah did is they made all the US soldiers, they made them designed. They designed them, they based them on real stories, on the real stories of how they went to Fallujah, how they fought, what they did, how they went door to door. And then because the experience of those soldiers was that they never knew what kind of danger is around the door, what kind of danger is in the next street, they basically decided that Fallujah is procedurally generated. So it's not even the real Fallujah in the game. It's sort of like what's the board game called? The Magical Maze?
Yeah.
Where things just kind of shift around to create new situations every time. The people you're shooting are procedurally generated. They're not good enough to be represented as people, and it harkens back to the old joke of like, you got to be careful with the US, because when the US invades you, it's not just they invade and come and kill your people. No, they'll make a movie about it 10 years later about how sad it made their soldiers, and that's 100% what this game is.
Yeah.
So we're not there yet. We're fighting it, and in the industry, as Muslim voices get louder, as Arab voices get louder, the demands for representation get stronger. But it also means that a game like this can really conjure up tremendous amount of controversy, and here we are talking about it.
Yeah. Obviously, we know there's a lot of really poor representation when it comes to video games. I do, however, feel like perhaps, and maybe you can correct me on this and educate me, there does seem to be a change for the better. I've seen more Arabs, more Arab names, more Muslims, being depicted in video games. So if you can give me like a brief kind of breakdown of what can we look forward to, and what is there already that's available that's very inspiring to see in video games.
I mean, I think things are hopeful, and I think this is true for many of the diversity issues in games. I think as games became the cultural force that they are, maybe the predominant cultural force on Earth with the amount of people playing games, games kind of had to grow up, and it's taking a while, and the right resources are not necessarily in place, especially at these larger companies. But there is an effort, a real genuine effort among creators, among developers who are generally very open-minded people, or generally people that want to do right, that want to create things that are meaningful and beautiful and fun and interesting. And that can be a shooter game. There's nothing against making something that is just fun to play, right? But as the industry grew, I think there's been a realization that all kinds of people play games, and that it's not fun, like me, to come to the realization that all my Dutch friends are the heroes in games and all my Arab friends are the bad guys in games, and it's just that isn't a good moment in any video game to play. So I think there's been this sort of like reckoning in games where developers are want to be better at this but don't necessarily know how. So you're seeing some well-intended efforts like the Call of Duty series, which have had in I think 3 subsequent games have had Arab characters, first as a NPC, a non-playable character that was coming along for the ride, and then afterwards even as a playable character, as a primary character, but still set in the
torn Arab country,
in Arabistan. And this time it was actually quite spectacular. Call of Duty managed to do Arab representation very good, but then attributed the Highway of Death, which is an actual like historical event from the wars, attributed it to the Russians, which was quite spectacular because that was 100% an American thing that happened. So we're not completely out of the woods yet. It's still very clear that the games industry has this this tendency to want to show the US as the good guys. But what is hopeful is that it's not just AAA developers making games anymore. Independent games, smaller games with smaller studios, like my old studio, are becoming more and more popular, and they're also it's becoming easier and easier to make games. So around the world, including in Muslim regions, game development has really taken like sort of a more and more prominent position in the job market. So for a lot of countries around the world, in Southwest Asia, in the Muslim countries, in the Middle East, in the Gulf states, in North Africa, and across Africa, honestly, basically everywhere. One of the biggest benefits about games is that if you have a computer, you can make games. And if you sell those games, you will earn your income in dollars. It'll always be in US dollars. A game is always going to be $7.99, so it's going to be $12.99, so it's always going to be $25. So if you can develop a game at a fraction of the cost, because the economy in the country you're in isn't quite as powerful as a lot of the Western economies, that actually puts you at a very strong advantage. And we've seen this with CD Projekt Red, the creators of Cyberpunk and the Witcher series, who were in Poland, where the economy just wasn't as strong. With The Witcher 1 being quite a mediocre game, and The Witcher 2 being good but not great, and then The Witcher 3 being a smash hit, they managed to grow every time just because economically it was possible. And I think a lot of governments, a lot of communities around the world are sort of seeing that economy, that digital economy, as an opportunity. So there's more and more financial support and resource support for these creators, creating these far more genuine, far more sincere representations of the region, far more sincere representations of characters, of the life of Muslims, of Arabs, Middle Eastern people, of Southwest Asian people, of Muslims everywhere in the world. And to me, that is very exciting, because the answer is never going to be the corporate answer. Like corporations are never going to do the work unless it makes them money. And yes, because there's been such an increase of gamers in the Gulf states, for example. A lot of big video games are now being translated to Arabic. And that started with Wally, which was the first game to ever be translated into Arabic, I think, in 2018 or something, the full translation. And then FIFA started happening, and then, FIFA turned out to be a massive hit in Arabic. And then now PlayStation is translating games like Horizon and games like that to full Arabic with full Arab voice casting, and they're getting all the things wrong. But what the thing that I always miss, the thing I always say is, like, the thing I want in media is I just want a full, proper adhan. That's it. As soon as we can hit that, I think we're in a much better spot, because it never happens. Because nobody's actually looking to portray Islam and the religion in any meaningful way in these big games, and it won't happen, because there's no point for it to happen. That then takes some time. It's a religious thing, so they're going to avoid it. They're going to avoid it like the plague. They'll put church bells in there, but they're not going to put it then there, because that's scary, right? So for me, the hope really is with these independent creators, these small teams making genuine games about their own culture, about their own lives, about their own stories, their own mythology, their own culture, their own history, their own music, their own language, their own foods. And there's so much beautiful stuff happening in that space, that, I do free consultancies for people who are trying to do things like that. And just every week I see a new beautiful thing where I'm like, when this comes out, it'll mean something. And when I talk to these developers, it's usually 1 to 2 years before they're done, but it's happening. It's happening. It's really happening. Games about the history of the region, games about the history of Islam, games in which the narrative of the protagonist is entwined with their faith without being fully defined by their faith. And that's really what we're looking for, is characters who are Muslim, but not characters who are just Muslim, right? Characters who are Muslim and a good person, Muslim and a hero, Muslim and a villain, Muslim and... because I don't need just good representation of Islam. There's enough to talk about in Islam. Things that we disagree on, that we might not be happy with. You're seeing it across the region.
Yeah.
There's enough unrest in our communities, in our countries, in our lives, that there is enough to say about like two Muslims disagreeing with each other and being the villain for each other's story. That's entirely possible. But for now,
Yeah.
we're always just a foil to the white hero, and that's not good enough. That's not it.
Rami, I appreciate you taking your time. Honestly, you've really schooled me when it comes to what is obviously a very fascinating and very deep industry with a lot of layers, which I didn't really kind of expect to think about video games or the video game industry that way. I wish we could, speak more as well. I know you're very busy. I did want to kind of leave you with the final question that I ask all of our guests on here. Obviously, faith means different things to different people. Spirituality means different things to different people. We have a vast array of guests on this show. Some are practicing, some are not. I should say some practice in their own way, some practice more traditionally. How does your faith, whatever you define that to be, and your spirituality inspire, or what relationship does it have with your love for this art form, which is video games?
I get that question frequently. And in my early work, I was a creator of arcade games. So there were games that were like small actiony games, and they didn't really have much narrative to it. But somebody asked me that question back in 2016, and I suddenly had the answer, which is most of my games at Vlambeer, at my old game studio, took place in the post-apocalypse. It was always after the end of the world, because we just kind of wanted a clean slate to tell these stories in. And the one thing somebody once pointed out is that there's not a single bottle of alcohol in the post-apocalypse that I create. Not a single one. And I had never noticed that, but always when it came up, when somebody drew a bottle, I was like, no, not that. And it wasn't like a conscious thing. It's just when you create art, your values transfer to that art. And for me, the idea that the way we deal with the post-apocalypse is getting drunk is just, that doesn't fit with me. I never, I don't drink. I've never drank anything. And part of that is obviously my faith. And for me, the idea that would be in something I create just didn't fit with me. So my faith, my religion is not very explicit in my work, but it is there. And I think that's the beauty of creating things like video games, is that you can't stop from leaving your fingerprint on it. And that's especially with things like games where there are so many specialists, so many different people all leaving their fingerprint on something. I think you get something very special.
Rami, appreciate you, bro. If anyone wants to reach out to you, or see what you're working on, and let us know what you're working on now, and where we'll see your name in the next few years. I'm working on lots of things. The easiest way to follow what I'm up to is Twitter, sadly, @THA_Rami, RAMI. From there, you can follow all the other things I work on, including my podcast, The Habibis, which is 3 Arab game developers talking about video games and the medium, including sometimes a little bit about Islam and faith and representation. So if people want to dive into that in games a bit, that exists as well. I'm excited. I'm curious to hear if you'll have more people from the industry, because there's so much to talk about. Yeah, for sure. I've been trying, but it's definitely something I really think that needs to be explored, because ultimately, like I said, not only is it an art form, but it's one of the most consumed, if not the most consumed art form in the world. So it is really refreshing to see that it's not as horrible as Hollywood is or was. So that's good. Rami, I appreciate you, man. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much.